Hi guys. So today we are going to draw trig graphs. So we're going to focus on sine and cosine, which are the ones that we've been finding all the pieces for. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually sketch the graph now. So when it comes to drawing these graphs, one of the most important things for us to do is actually going to be to label our x and y axis. So we're not going to use the same graph paper that we normally use whenever we're drawing these, just because it doesn't make a lot of sense with our radian values and things like that you could see on the x-axis. So what you'll typically see is graph paper that kind of looks like this, where you've got a y-axis and then you have a much longer x-axis so that you're able to kind of draw your wave on there. So what we'll do is we'll have to mark our y-axis and our x-axis. So when we mark our y-axis, we're going to mark three things: the lowest possible value, the highest possible value, and the middle value. So based off what we know off these equations, that middle value is always the d, okay? It's always what you've added or subtracted to the end of the equation, okay? That's the vertical shift. Then what we do after we mark the middle of our graph is we're going to move up from that point and we're going to move down from that point. The amount that we move down is the amplitude, A, and that's going to tell us what the highest and the lowest points on our y-axis are. So then what we're going to do is we're going to mark the x-axis, and this one's going to be a little bit harder. So the first point on the x-axis that we're going to mark is the C value. That is your phase shift. So the first thing we mark is the phase shift. Then, this is the new part for today, we're going to find how often we're going to have one of the points on our graph. So when I say critical points, what I mean is either a low point, a middle point, or a high point. Because if you think about these graphs, all right, there are a lot of different points that we're going to draw on there, but the only ones really going to focus on are the highest points, the lowest points, and the ones that go through the middle. So to figure out how far apart we space each of those, what we're going to do is we're going to take the period and we're going to divide it by 4. And in case you forgot, the period is 2 pi divided by b. So what we do, once we figure out that spacing, we're going to keep adding that spacing to that C value until we have enough points on our graph. Once we have all of our axes marked, we're just going to draw the dots that follow the pattern of our graph. So sine starts in the middle. After the middle, it goes up, and then it's a wave. So after it's at the highest point, okay, and instead of up, I'm going to say high point. Then it comes back to the middle, then it goes to the lowest point, and then it comes back to the middle. Cosine, on the other hand, starts at the top, so it starts with the highest point. Then it goes down to the middle, down to the bottom, back up to the middle, and then up to the top. So let's go ahead and actually draw some of these. So again, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to mark the axis. All right, so we'll start by marking the y-axis. That one's a little bit easier. The first thing I'm going to mark is the middle y value. That's your vertical shift. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and mark -1. Then I'm going to mark the highest point in this graph and the lowest point in this graph. Well, the amplitude is 2. So from the middle, I'm going to go up 2 and down 2. So what I'm going to do now, if you're using Notability, if you're using paper, you can use a highlighter. If you're using Notability, I would use the little highlighter there. I don't have the thing to make it nice straight lines, but I am just going to go ahead and extend those lines so we know where our middle, high, and low points are going to go. So now our y-axis is marked. Now we're going to mark the x-axis. The first point on the x-axis that I'm going to mark is my phase shift. Well, in this case, there's nothing. We have not added or subtracted anything. So the first point I'm going to mark is 0. So now to figure out how much to add each time, I need to figure out what the period is first. The period is 2 pi divided by b. So the period is 8, because our pi's will cancel out. So it's going to take 8 radians, and not 8 pi. Sometimes there'll be a pi, sometimes there won't. But it's going to be 8 radians for this graph to fully complete one cycle. So to figure out our spacing, we take the period, and we divide it by 4. So if I take 8 and divide it by 4, I get 2. So that's how much I'm going to add to get each next x-axis value. So starting at 0, I add 2, and then I just keep adding 2. Okay, if you're not sure how many points to add, you can draw a couple, and then again, just see if your graph has started to repeat. All right, so now we actually sketch our graph. This is where it matters, is this sine or is this cosine? So in this case, this one is cosine. Okay, cosine's pattern starts high. So at the highest point on my first x-axis point, I'm going to make a high point. The next x-axis point is going to be a middle point. The next x-axis point is a low point, and then a middle point, and then a high point, and then a middle point, and then a low point. And then we just continue that pattern until we have drawn as many cycles as it tells us to draw. In this case, it says to sketch 2 cycles. So I want this graph to repeat itself twice. Well, there's 1 cycle. And again, I'm going to need a few more dots to get all the way up to 2 cycles. So I'm going to add 1 more x value there. And that's my graph. All right, domain and range. Well, we all know the domain is -infinity to infinity. Range is our lowest y value to our highest y value, and we put brackets around those. All right, let's try another. The nice thing about these, sine or cosine, the marking of the axes is going to be the exact same. All right, so let's start with marking the y-axis. Let's start with our middle y value, 2, the vertical shift. The amplitude is 10. So from 2, I'm going to go up 10 and down 10. So 2 plus 10 is 12, 2 minus 10 is -8. So then I'm going to take some highlighters, and I'm going to mark middle, high, and low. All right, now let's deal with the x-axis. So I'll start with the first x value that I mark. That's going to be my shift, my phase shift. So that's going to be to the right 1. So +1 is my phase shift. Now let's figure out how much I'm going to need to add to get each of those next points. So let's find the period. 2 pi divided by pi over 2. So 2 pi over 1 times 2 over pi is 4. So that's the full period. That's not how much we're going to add to get each next point. To get each next point, we take the critical, or we take the period, and we divide it by 4. So I'm going to add 1. So it's a little bit easy to count for at least. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All right, then we draw our graph. All right, so this one was sine. Sine starts middle, middle, high, middle low, middle high, middle low. So we start with, at the first x value that we marked, middle. Then we go up, then we go down, and then we go to the bottom. And then we just keep following that pattern until we have 2 cycles of this graph. All right, again, the period here, if you think about it, we already found that, but the period is how long it takes this graph to repeat itself. All right, well, this graph repeats itself at that point. The distance from 1 to 5 is 4, so that matches what we already have. All right, domain, -infinity to infinity, range bottom to top, -8 to 12, in brackets. All right, let's try the next one. This one's going to be a little bit trickier because we're not going to use whole numbers on the x-axis. They're going to be pi values. But the y-axis points do not change. We still do that the exact same way. Middle y value, there's nothing added, so that's 0. Highest y value, the amplitude is 1, and -1. So I'm going to mark my high, my middle, and my low. All right, now we'll mark the x-axis. So we start by marking the phase shift. So negative pi over 4 is the first point that I'm going to mark on the x-axis. Now let's find the period. 2 pi divided by 2. The period is pi. So the critical point spacing is every pi over 4. So what I do is I start at negative pi over 4 and I add pi over 4. Well, negative pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 0. If I add pi over 4 again, I'm at 1 pi over 4. Now, if this point, you may struggle a little bit with adding these values. If you need to use a calculator, double check yourself, that's okay. But if I have pi over 4 and I add pi over 4, I have 2 pi over 4. Then I'm at 3 pi over 4, 4 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4. And it's going to keep because I'm adding pi over 4 each time. Now, if you want to go back and reduce these, that would be great, and that would be really good practice. For the sake of drawing these graphs, it's okay if you leave it like this, but it would be good practice for you to go ahead and reduce them. Like, for example, 4 pi over 4, that's just pi. 2 pi over 4, that's just pi over 2. All right, now we're going to draw our sine function. So sine starts in the middle. So the first x-axis value that we marked is a middle point. The next point we marked goes up. And then we're just going to keep following that pattern. So every point we've marked on the x-axis is either a middle point, a high point, or a low point. And we just follow our pattern. Domain is negative infinity to infinity. Range, negative 1 to 1. All right, this one has a reflection, but the first steps are going to be the same. Okay, mark your middle y value. Amplitude is 1, so up 1, down 1. So that tells me my lowest, my highest, and my middle. So my phase shift here, plus pi, is to the left. Sorry about that. Problem is I did these during my off period, which is also when the lunches are, so that's why the bells always go off. All right, so negative pi is the first point that I marked. That's my phase shift. Let's find the period. 2 pi over 1 divided by 1/2. So that's times 2 over 1. So that's 4 pi. So the spacing of my points is pi. So I'm going to keep adding pi. So negative pi plus pi is 0. Plus pi, plus pi, plus pi, and I keep adding until I can get 2 cycles of this graph. All right, so the difference here now with the reflection. Normally for cosine, we would do a high point, a middle point, and then a low point. But because it's reflected, we're going to do a low point, a middle point, and a high point. So the pattern's the same from that point on, but the first point that we mark looks a little bit different. Domain is negative infinity to infinity. Range is negative 1 to 1. All right, if you feel comfortable, pause the video, try this one on your own. All right, so middle y value, negative 1. Amplitude is 5. So plus 5, minus 5. So that gives me my middle, my high, and my low. Now we mark the x-axis. I'm going to the left pi, so negative pi. Let's find the period. 2 pi divided by 1. That's just 2 pi. So critical point spacing, that's 2 pi divided by 4, which is pi over 2. So now I'm going to start at negative pi, and I probably should scoot that over a little bit. Did not leave a lot of space here. All right, there we go. So I'm going to start at negative pi, and I'm going to add pi over 2. So negative pi, if I want to get a common denominator, that's negative 2 pi over 2. Then if I add pi over 2, I'm at negative pi over 2. Negative pi over 2 plus pi over 2 is 0. 0 plus pi over 2 is pi over 2. Plus pi over 2 is 2 pi over 2. 3 pi over 2. 4 pi over 2. Until I have enough points to get 2 cycles of this graph. Again, if you want to reduce these, great. It's good practice, but if you don't, that's okay. All right, then we'll actually draw our graph. This was sine. Sine starts with a middle point. So the first x-axis value is middle. But instead of going up, it's going to move down because it was reflected. And then we just finish our pattern. Domain is negative infinity to infinity, and range is negative 6 to 4. All right, last one. Same thing we've been doing. The only difference is our equation doesn't look like it's the same format, so we need to rewrite it. We need to factor out that 2 before we find our phase shift. All right, so again, finding your high and low y values, that has not changed. Middle y is 1. Up 1, down 1. So the lowest point, the middle point, and the highest point. Mark our x-axis. Phase shift is negative pi over 2. Period, 2 pi divided by 2. Critical points, pi divided by 4. So negative pi over 2 plus pi over 4. So I'm going to rewrite negative pi over 2 with a common denominator. That's negative 2 pi over 4. So if I do negative 2 pi over 4, and I add pi over 4, I get negative pi over 4. So that is my next, I don't have a lot of space there, sorry guys. That is my next x-axis point. Should have kept you guys, gave you a little bit more space there. Negative pi over 4 plus pi over 4 is 0. 0 plus pi over 4 is pi over 4. 2 pi over 4. 3 pi over 4. 4 pi over 4. 5 pi over 4 until we get to enough points. Then we sketch our graph. This one's cosine. Cosine starts with a high point. So the first point I'm going to plot is a high point. Middle, low, middle, high, and then you just follow that pattern. And there's your graph. I missed 2 of the points, but that is what your graph is going to look like. All right, domain, negative infinity to infinity, and range is from 0 to 2. All right, so that is it for these graphs. So again, make sure you know your patterns, which one's sine, which one's cosine. And then the hardest thing about these is just going to be the marking of your x-axis. So again, find your phase shift. That's the first x-axis value. Then find the critical point spacing and just keep adding that to get each next x-axis value point.